Imagine finding two skeletons buried just a few hundred kilometers apart, both in the same country, both from roughly the same era, and discovering they have absolutely nothing in common genetically. Zero. Like finding two people who supposedly lived in the same neighborhood but came from opposite ends of the planet. That's exactly what scientists uncovered when they cracked open the ancient DNA hidden inside bones found deep in two British caves. And what they found didn't just surprise them. It completely shattered what we thought we knew about who first set foot on these islands. This isn't a story about kings or conquests. This is a story about people who lived over 13,000 years ago, people who carved skulls into drinking cups, people who hunted beasts that no longer walk this earth, and then, without warning, vanished entirely. No descendants, no trace in modern DNA, just gone. So settle in, because we're about to go on a journey back to the very beginning of Britain's human story. And trust me, it's stranger than anything you learned in school. Let's set the scene. Picture Britain 15,000 years ago. No cities, no roads, no people, just ice. Massive, grinding glaciers covering more than 2/3 of the island, stretching as far as the eye could see. The entire place was a frozen wasteland, completely uninhabitable for thousands of years. But slowly, gradually, the planet began to warm. The ice started its long retreat northward, and for the first time in an age, the land beneath was exposed again, green, wild, and waiting. And humans being humans, they didn't wait long. As soon as conditions allowed, the first pioneers made their move. Back then, Britain wasn't an island. It was connected to continental Europe by a vast stretch of land, a natural bridge that allowed people, animals, and entire ecosystems to migrate freely. Groups of hunter-gatherers, following the herds of reindeer and wild horses northward as the tundra opened up, walked right into Britain. These weren't primitive cave dwellers shuffling around in animal skins. These were skilled, intelligent people, craftsmen, hunters, survivors, who had navigated the brutal conditions of Ice Age Europe and lived to tell the tale. The first real window into their lives comes from a limestone cave carved into the dramatic landscape of Somerset in the southwest of England. This place is called Gough's Cave, buried inside the famous Cheddar Gorge. And when archaeologists started excavating properly, what they found inside was genuinely unsettling. Human bones. Lots of them, but not buried in the way you'd expect. These bones had been processed. Deliberately, carefully, skillfully processed. Stone tools had been used to cut the flesh from the bone. Skulls had been shaped and hollowed out, transformed, it appears, into drinking vessels. And the bones themselves showed something even more disturbing, marks from human teeth. Not animal teeth. Human. The people of Gough's Cave practiced ritual cannibalism. Now before you recoil, it's worth understanding this wasn't random violence or desperate survival. The evidence suggests this was ceremonial. The skulls were crafted with real precision and care. They weren't just cracked open and discarded. These objects mattered to the people who made them. Whether it was a way of honoring the dead, absorbing their strength, or marking important rituals, we can't say for certain. But it was intentional. It was meaningful. And it tells us something profound. These earliest Britons had rich, complex spiritual lives. They weren't just surviving. They were thinking about life, death, and what comes after. When scientists finally managed to extract DNA from a female skeleton inside Gough's Cave, dated to around 15,000 years ago, the results were extraordinary. Her mitochondrial DNA, which is the genetic code passed directly from mother to daughter down through generations, belonged to a group scientists call haplogroup U8A. Now, that might sound like a code from a filing cabinet, but here's why it matters. This particular genetic lineage had been found before in Ice Age hunter-gatherers right across Europe. In caves in Germany, Belgium, Spain. It was a clear marker of a specific population, the so-called Magdalenian people, who had spread across northwest Europe as the glaciers melted. But here's the kicker. This genetic signature, U8A, had never appeared in any other prehistoric British individual. Not before her, not after. She was, genetically speaking, completely unique in the British archaeological record. Her people had walked into Britain as part of that first great wave of post-Ice Age migration. They hunted red deer, wild horses, and aurochs, enormous, powerful cattle that would dwarf anything alive today. They crafted tools from mammoth ivory and reindeer antler. They were, in every sense, people of the open tundra, and they thrived there. For a time. Now here's where the story takes a turn that even the scientists weren't prepared for. Just 1,000 years later, a blink of an eye in geological terms, researchers examined remains from another cave, this one on the north coast of Wales. Kendrick's Cave, overlooking the sea. And the man whose bones rested there told a completely different story. His DNA showed zero genetic connection to the woman from Goth's Cave. None. You'd expect some overlap, some shared ancestry, even a distant connection, but there was nothing. He belonged to a completely separate population, one that researchers call the Western hunter-gatherers, who had expanded into Europe from an entirely different direction and through an entirely different route. And his lifestyle couldn't have been more different either. Where the Goth's Cave, people hunted land animals on the open plain. The man from Kendrick's Cave and his kin were coastal, maritime people. They ate fish. They hunted seals. They had an intimate relationship with the sea. And rather than crafting skull cups, they buried their dead with beautifully decorated horse bones, suggesting their ceremonies and spiritual beliefs were entirely their own. Think about what that means for a second. Two groups of people, same island, same 1,000-year window of time, completely genetically unrelated, completely different diets, completely different burial customs. It's as if someone dropped two utterly alien cultures into the same place and said, right, figure it out. Dr. Selina Brace from the Natural History Museum, one of the scientists behind this research, described it plainly. They had found two completely separate populations living in Britain within just 1,000 years of each other. Complete strangers. Genetically speaking, they might as well have been from different planets. So what happened? How did these two populations end up on the same island? And more importantly, why does neither of them show up in the DNA of people living in Britain today? The answer, as best as scientists can piece together, comes down to one brutal word: replacement. Total, almost complete, population replacement. Here's how it played out for the first group, the Magdalenian people, the ones who left that unique U8A genetic signature. As the centuries passed, the climate didn't just warm a little. It transformed. The open, windswept tundra that had defined Britain's landscape for thousands of years began to disappear. In its place, thick, dense forests spread across the island. And with the landscape changing, the animals changed too. The reindeer herds that the Magdalenians depended on, the backbone of their diet, their tool-making, their entire way of life, either died out in Britain or followed the retreating cold northward. And the Magdalenians, it seems, went with them, or simply couldn't adapt quickly enough. Either way, they vanished from the British genetic record entirely. Cosimo Post, a geneticist at the University of Tübingen who reviewed the research, called it remarkable. In an almost absurdly short time frame, you can watch, through DNA, a complete population being replaced in the British Isles. The people who came in to fill that vacuum were the Western hunter-gatherers, already adapted to wooded, coastal environments. They knew how to fish rivers and streams. They could hunt in dense forest rather than open plain. They were, in evolutionary terms, better suited to the new Britain. And so they thrived. Within a few centuries, they had become the dominant population. The Magdalenians, including the woman from Goth's Cave and every person like her, left almost no biological trace behind. But wait, because this was just the beginning. Britain's story of replacement was far from over. Fast forward to about 6,000 years ago. The island by now has been home to those Western hunter-gatherers for thousands of years. And then, from the southeast, a new wave of migrants arrives. Farmers from Anatolia, what we now call Turkey and the surrounding region, who had mastered the art of agriculture, began pushing into Europe. They brought with them crops, livestock, and a completely different way of organizing society. And when they arrived in Britain, they replaced more than 99% of the existing hunter-gatherer population. Think about that. Almost complete erasure, again. The people who had lived there for millennia, who knew every river and forest path, were essentially gone, absorbed, displaced, or simply outcompete within a few generations. Then, around 4,500 years ago, it happened again. A group known as the Bell Beaker people, who originated from the vast Eurasian steppes, swept into Britain and replaced around 90% of those Anatolian farmers. Yes, The people who replaced the hunter-gatherers then got replaced themselves. Even the builders of Stonehenge, those mysterious, remarkable engineers who dragged massive stones across impossible distances, were largely swept away by the new arrivals, leaving their monument behind as the only evidence they were ever there. Professor David Reich of Harvard University, one of the world's leading authorities on ancient DNA, has calculated something that stops you in your tracks. Less than 0.1% of modern British ancestry can be traced back to the original hunter-gatherers who first walked into Britain when the Ice Age ended. Less than 0.1%. Those first people, the ones who lit fires in the darkness of Goth's Cave, who shaped skulls with careful hands, who carried that rare and never again seen U8A genetic marker, they left almost nothing of themselves behind in the people alive today. Now, here's the question that science still hasn't fully answered. And honestly, it's the one that keeps researchers up at night. Where did the Magdalenians go? 3 possibilities sit on the table. First, they died out. The collapse of their food sources, the reindeer, the horses, the open tundra ecosystem, was simply too fast for them to adapt. They starved, or their population fell too low to sustain itself, and they simply ceased to exist as a group. It's a cold ending, but it's happened to plenty of species throughout history. Second possibility, they migrated. Following the retreating cold northward, chasing the herds they depended on, they moved out of Britain and back into continental Europe or further north still. If that's the case, their descendants might still exist somewhere, perhaps in populations that haven't yet been fully studied with ancient DNA techniques. Third possibility, something else entirely happened, something the bones haven't told us yet, some event or process that the archaeological record hasn't yet revealed. And given how many times this field has been blindsided by unexpected discoveries, like the fact that 2 genetically unrelated populations were living in Britain simultaneously, that third option can never be fully ruled out. What makes this so haunting is the personal dimension of it. The woman from Goth's Cave was a real person. She lived, she hunted, she participated in ceremonies we can barely imagine. She looked up at the same sky, felt the same wind off the tundra, knew the faces of people she loved. And now, 15,000 years later, her DNA sits in a laboratory and scientists stare at it and say, she belongs to nobody. Her genetic line ended. She is, in the most literal biological sense, a dead end. But here's the hopeful part, and there is one, I promise. Science is moving fast. Ancient DNA research has exploded in the last decade, with new techniques allowing researchers to extract genetic information from remains that were previously thought too degraded, too old, or too damaged to yield anything useful. Scientists are now pulling DNA from ancient sediment, essentially from the dirt on the floor of ancient sites, and finding traces of people who left no bones at all. Ancient proteins are being analyzed in teeth and bone fragments, telling us about diet, health, and ancestry in ways that were impossible just 10 years ago. Every new discovery has the potential to rewrite the chapter we thought we'd already closed. New remains found in a cave somewhere, or a reanalysis of bones sitting in a museum drawer for decades, could suddenly reveal connections nobody expected. The Magdalenians of Britain might not be as lost as we currently think. Their story might simply be waiting in a box of unexamined samples, or in a sediment layer that hasn't been properly tested yet. And that's what makes ancient history so endlessly, infuriatingly, brilliantly exciting. The past is not fixed. It shifts every time we find something new. So let's bring it all together. About 15,000 years ago, the very first humans walked into Britain across a land bridge from Europe. They were the Magdalenians, skilled, spiritually complex, genetically unique people who carried a DNA signature found nowhere else in prehistoric Britain. 1,000 years later, a completely separate group, the Western hunter-gatherers, were also living on the island. Unrelated, different in diet, different in belief. Over time, the Magdalenians disappeared entirely. Then the Western hunter-gatherers were replaced by Anatolian farmers. Then those farmers were replaced by the Bell Beaker people from the steppes. Layer upon layer upon layer of replacement, each one nearly total, each one leaving the previous inhabitants as little more than a faint ghost in the modern genetic record. Britain, it turns out, has always been a place people came to, shaped, and were then replaced by whoever came next. The island we think of as ancient and unchanging has actually been in a state of constant, dramatic human flux for as long as people have lived there. And somewhere in that story, somewhere between the candlelit depths of Goff's Cave and the coastal winds of Kendrick's Cave, the very first Britons lived, loved, and eventually left the world without a single living descendant to carry their story forward. Their bones tell us they were here. Their DNA proves they were unique. But what happened to them remains one of the most haunting mysteries in all of human prehistory. If this kind of deep history gets your brain buzzing the way it gets mine going, then do yourself a favor. Hit like, drop a comment with what surprised you most, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next dive into the hidden past. Because trust me, we're just getting started. The ancient world has plenty more secrets left to give up, and we'll be right here when it does.